The SM.92 was an experimental modification of the earlier SM.91. The 91, which we also have in War Thunder, was itself a prototype design intended to fill the need for a long-range multi-role aircraft that had been unfilled for several years. With advances in aircraft engines during the late 1930s and early 1940s, Italian planners had similar ideas to those in many other nations, and figured that a properly designed and equipped twin-engine fighter could be a jack-of-all-trades to perform various air combat tasks, recon, and ground attack, all in one airframe. Once the German DB605 engines became available, this effort was renewed, and in 1942 they solicited designs for a new twin-engine fighter. This led to the SM-91, which was developed quickly thanks to earlier work on similar designs. The SM-91 had a twin boom layout similar to the American P-38, and the first prototype flew in 1943. The initial testing showed promise, although it failed to hit its performance goals during early flights. To improve on this, the SM-92 was quickly designed and produced by removing the center section of the plane and moving the cockpit to the left side engine boom. A number of other changes were made at the same time, including some minor modifications to the fuel system, the addition of a remote-controlled tail gun, improvements to the landing gear, and a new weapon installation. The SM-92 prototype flew in November of 1943 under German supervision, and it did show notably improved performance over the SM-91, but leadership was generally inclined to focus production on existing fighters instead of a new design that would have taken time to get up and running. The program suffered a fatal delay in early 1944 when it was damaged during a test flight in a friendly fire incident, which delayed the testing schedule. The SM-92 program was finally abandoned shortly afterwards when the only prototype was destroyed during an Allied bombing raid. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the SM-92, a strike aircraft in Rank 3 of the Italian tech tree at Battle Rating 4.0. Being a 1940s prop fighter, this plane doesn't have any advanced combat systems. Its primary armament is a set of 4 12.7mm machine guns, and a trio of 20mm cannons, all facing forward. You get a fair selection of ammo belts, but my preference is the stealth belt for the 12.7mm and the air targets belt for the 20mm, as the cannon belt is full of hard-hitting Minengeschoss ammo. There's also a remotely operated tailgun turret with another 12.7mm gun, but the field of fire is exceptionally narrow despite the gun's position, with only a 2-degree field of fire, so don't expect much out of the tailgun. It's functionally useless. The loadouts include a few different options for bombs, all carried externally. If you're going for close air support, the pair of GP500s is probably your best bet. Otherwise, all of them are just fine for ground attack and air battles. The flight performance of the SM-92 is a lot better than I expected when I first flew this plane. The acceleration is decent, the rate of climb is at least average, and the top-end speed isn't bad for a plane at this BR. It can max out at a little over 600 kilometers an hour up at altitude, but in a practical sense, you're going to top out in the high 400s unless you somehow get like 3 or 4 minutes to just accelerate in level flight. Something this plane does quite well is dive. The wings won't rip off until over 800 kilometers an hour, and the plane actually has air brakes, which makes controlling your speed pretty easy, and the controls won't lock up very quickly, allowing for a good level of controllability if you're doing a dive bomb or coming down on an air target from high altitude. The energy retention coming out of a dive is pretty good if you go into web and don't turn. Now, in terms of maneuverability, again, the SM-92 ended up being much better than I expected it to be. The rate of roll isn't good, and the rudder lags a bit, more on that later. But that's where the bad news ends. It pulls really well on the vertical axis, and its turn rate is pretty solid until you run out of speed. You can use combat flaps up to about 500 kilometers an hour, but just remember, it's going to bleed energy, so you usually only want to throw them out for a couple of seconds at a time. The ideal speed range for agility is going to be between 350 and 500 kilometers an hour. Really though, the SM-92 flies a lot better than most other twin-engine fighters, and it can even outmaneuver a lot of single-engine planes, but just don't let that go to your head. Stuff like Spitfires and Zeros are still going to fly circles around you. There isn't any manual engine control with this plane, but it's fairly well cooled, and you can use WEP pretty freely as long as you keep an eye on your engine temps. Taking the SM-92 out in air battles is a lot of fun. It's classed as a strike aircraft, and it gets an interceptor spawn in RB, which gives you a lot of flexibility if you want to do ground pounding, go multi-role, or just focus on air combat. Now, something I want to focus on for a minute is the forward firepower of this plane. It's crazy, but there are some caveats. None of its guns are very accurate, which you might think is a disadvantage, but it's really not. The high quantity of guns and the generous supply of ammunition lets you just aim in the general direction of targets and hold the trigger to fill a huge chunk of the sky with Minengeschoss rounds out of the 20mm and whatever you loaded the 12.7s with. The inaccuracy of the guns, combined with the laggy rudder, make precision aiming pretty difficult, and I still miss a lot of shots with this plane, but it just doesn't matter. The spread and quantity of the shots will be enough to get you hits, just pointing in the general direction of your targets. Even when I was still grinding upgrades with this plane, getting high-scoring matches isn't too difficult as long as you don't screw up your basic ACM too often. In terms of ground attack, you can take some bombs, and the armored targets belt for the 20mm isn't too bad. You won't be able to take out a base in air battles, but dive bombing attacks can still be pretty accurate, and the plane does surprisingly well in close air support. Once you're finished upgrades, I generally suggest the pair of GP500s for ground attack, as they hit hard and they have a good blast radius. You can pop lighter targets with the cannons flying close air support, and really I found the SM-92 to be a pretty effective multi-role fighter flying out over a ground battle. Visually, this is a weird looking plane, but if I'm being honest, the weirdness kinda grew on me. You get a few different custom paint jobs, including a German one if that's your fancy, and overall I think it's pretty neat looking and definitely a nice change of pace from the stuff we normally have in the game. Landing the SM-92 is actually kinda difficult. You can drop gear at around 300 kilometers an hour and landing flaps at about 250, and the air brakes do help to slow down, but the problem is that once you're on the runway, the plane really loves to nose over with even the smallest amount of braking. I let it happen on purpose here just to show you, and I strongly suggest practicing your landings with this one. The cockpit on this plane feels, well, cramped. The visibility isn't very good, and the instruments are all drawn on instead of modeled. I don't recommend this plane with a VR headset. It gets really awkward. To close out on the SM-92. This plane has very strong forward firepower. Its flight performance is much better than people expect out of a twin-engine prop like this. It gets an air spawn in RB, and it's a credible platform for ground attack. However, the tailgun is useless. It's got a laggy rudder, and it's physically a large target. The final verdict on the SM-92 is that generally this plane is really good, and if you're going up through the Italian tech tree, I highly recommend spending some time in this one. Once you get used to its quirks, it's a very strong performer. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.